Hi. It's wonderful to see you all and all those new faces. Christine, I haven't seen you for yonks.
Oh, but I look younger every day.
Every day, just like me. And new people. Yeah. Hi. Nice to meet you.
Hi.
And Anna and Meredy, people we don't really know. Sorry to pick on you, but that's life in this little chat room. Hi, welcome. So wonderful to see new faces here.
Hello.
Hi. And most of all, to welcome Sasha. Most of you, well, some of you know Sasha from the NSPC, Middlesex University in the UK. Sasha has spoken before on this group around existential coaching. She teaches that and is responsible for that at the NSPC. So we've got Sasha again, which is brilliant. And I'm going to ask her to give a proper introduction to herself again. And we also have Ruth, who I also haven't seen for yonks. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind introducing yourselves to the group. People will join as time goes on. But what I like to do is absolutely not take any responsibility or control and just hand straight to you two.
I love that policy. I think I need to adopt that policy in various areas of my life, Julia.
Yeah.
You and me both, Sash. I think it sounds great, doesn't it? Let's do that. No responsibility, no control. It definitely will make life a lot easier. Maybe.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. Ruth and I have come to talk about neurodiversity, and we will talk about how that links to existential practice as well, although it won't be all geared towards that. So we'll give a kind of an overview of neurodivergence and what that means and its sort of various different forms, but we'll also talk about how to work with that in a kind of therapeutic way, and particularly looking at how well, we think in our work there are so many pertinent links to existential approaches, and we'll go into that in quite a bit more detail over the course of the time we have together. So as Julia mentioned, I'm a coach. I'm an existential coach, and I work at the New School of Psychotherapy and Counselling in the UK, where I'm the course leader for that programme. But also I am autistic myself. And Ruth and I have been working together for, a few years now, really plugging away at providing more diverse and more appropriate services, basically, for autistic adults particularly, and doing that really with an existential lens. So we have various projects together. It's really nice to come and speak to you together. Ruth, do you want to introduce yourself?
I will, thank you so much. So yes, I'm Ruth. I am a psychotherapist, existential psychotherapist, and I also work at the New School. So I actually am the deputy course leader for the Masters in Autism and Neurodevelopmental Conditions. We also have postgraduate certificates in ADHD and autism as well. So, and my background has been working with autism and neurodiversity for about, nearly 18 years, I think now. And that has included doing kind of lots of post-diagnostic work, which really is very much a coaching type of structure. And I've done that for about 15 years. So when I met Sasha at the New School, a frighteningly long time ago now, one of the first conversations we had was actually talking about our approaches when working with autistic and neurodiverse people, and me saying, oh my goodness, this is really similar in terms of the coaching work that I've been doing for many years. And interestingly, also the kind of existential framework I'd been doing before actually being trained existentially. So, but yes, so that's kind of a brief rundown of me. The plan of action is just to have some time to talk with you about autism and neurodiversity more generally, and then give some ideas and tools around what might be useful when working with people. So hopefully it'll be stuff that you know, you can go away with. I've got some slides to show you later, and I will email them to Julia, and then you're more than anyone can have them who wants them. So I will make sure that you get those. Yeah.
Cool.
Shall I do that now, Sash?
Yeah, go for it.
Sharing?
Let's do a screen share.
Let's see. Oh, what I should say is, as you can see, Sash and I are pretty relaxed.
Yes.
So we'll we'll rabbit on about various different things and show you the slides.
Yeah.
But please shout if you've got any questions or any comments.
Absolutely.
And if you want to whack any comments in the chat as well, we will keep our beady eyes on that too. So yeah, just feel free to comment, shout, whatever. Okay, right, I'm going to try and share. Yes, I can. Good. Okay. Now, it's really lovely to be able to chat with you all. Actually, I know kind of what you do through Julia and Sasha, so it's kind of exciting for me to get to speak with you. Right, can we see the slideshow?
Yeah,
yes.
All good.
Good. Increasing, excellent start. Right, okay. I should ask actually, how many of you work with autistic and neurodiverse people? I'm also dyslexic, so I'm another part of the neurodiversity spectrum. So is it something that is kind of very present within your kind of lives at the moment?
Yeah.
You want us to show hands?
Yeah, show hands.
Symbols?
Or, yeah.
Lovely.
Cool. Okay, awesome. Righty-ho. So first, it may be that for some of you this is kind of stuff that you already know. For some of you it might not be. So forgive us if we're going over stuff that you already know. Hopefully it just kind of gets some of the foundations in. So neurodevelopmental conditions, what we're talking about here is differences in the growth and development of the brain and nervous system. So it's differences in the way that the brain is structured and developed. And this is crucial because very often, and has been for a long time, it will be confused with a mental health diagnosis or an intellectual disability. So people will be called that they've said that they've got a mental health problem, or it will be assumed that they have an intellectual disability if they're autistic or if they have another neurodiversity, and they are entirely different things. So somebody can have depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and also be autistic, but not necessarily. Somebody can have an intellectual disability and also have dyspraxia, but they aren't necessarily going together. So it's quite an important distinction that sometimes can be confused. So the things that we're talking about are autism spectrum is one, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is another one, ADD, attention deficit disorder, that's just the attention issue without the hyperactivity, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette's. Also, there's others as well. So FSA's fecal alcohol syndrome, which also comes under neurodevelopmental condition, and obviously is linked to when the mum is having alcohol in the womb. But the main ones that you'll see most likely would be the ones that I've kind of highlighted there, that prevalence-wise you might see most likely. Now, I don't know, do you guys use the DSM or do you use the ICD? You use the DSM?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those are the two. I think there are a few therapists here. Maybe they can also answer. There's a lot of coaches.
Yeah.
But I see Sarah Ann, you're a therapist. Hey, Sarah Ann?
Yes, and yeah, we use the DSM.
Yeah.
ICD-10 codes for medical aids, but DSM for diagnosis.
Thanks, Sarah Ann, that's wicked. So in the same way then, individuals who would come to you who may have some of these diagnoses, generally if they've got a diagnosis through a medical professional, it will be done using that. And the main thing really to highlight with this is that the DSM gets changed all the time. Yes. So the terminology gets changed all the time, and it's tricky. You know, the latest one is now autism spectrum disorder, for example. They've slightly shifted around some of the ADHD ones as well. And I think it's just worth bearing in mind that often it's really not clear cut, and that can be problematic for individuals, both in terms of getting a diagnosis if they need one and they want one, and in terms of knowing what that means and how to kind of process it. And the last thing, really, just in terms of kind of diagnosis, is just being really mindful of the terminology you use. So generally speaking, with autism and with other disabilities, it's most individuals will say that they prefer identity first. So that means that you say they're an autistic person as opposed to another person with autism, because you tend to say things like, you know, with cancer. So it's a hint towards it being a kind of pathology, which is incorrect, and you know, and can be, you know, really tricky for some people. So, however, massively varies. So, you know, it's always worth just listening out for whatever your client, the terminology they're using.
Yeah.
So some people want to be called autistic, some people might have the term Asperger's. Sorry, Sash, what were you going to say?
Yeah, no, I was just going to jump in on the Asperger's bit, because there's been a real movement recently within the autistic community around that particular terminology. So that's partly because it's no longer a sort of diagnostic category. So it used to be that people would get diagnosed specifically with Asperger's syndrome. That doesn't happen anymore because of the changes to the DSM. But also there's been a bit of a backlash in the community because of who Hans Asperger was as a person. So there are a lot of people now who won't use the term because they don't like what he himself stood for. Now, I haven't looked into that in great details, but it's basically links to Nazism and other sort of dodgy right-wing style stuff. So there are some people who now will not use that term just out of principle. But likewise, there are some people who, even though they acknowledge that part of it, still really stick to that term because that's what they were diagnosed with. That was the term that they were given, you know, by a psychiatrist. And that was the term that really made sense to them and kind of helped to sort of form their identity as an autistic person. So again, you know, you always get these minefields around terminology.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. And you know, also it may be that some of the people that you work with really don't use or refer to their neurodiversity very much at all. I think that's always worth bearing in mind. Like, I work with a lot of people where it's clear they don't want to talk about it, they don't want to be defined in those terms, and that is absolutely understandable. And I might adapt some of the way that I engage with them, but I wouldn't necessarily put a label on that because it's not necessary and they don't use that label. So it's just about having that kind of sense of attunement, really. Okay. So neurodiversity is a term that I'm sure most of you have heard of. So it's a paradigm of seeing the differences in the brain development and function that we talked about as different as opposed to inherently pathological. So it was kind of Judy Singer, who's autistic, has got autistic and neurodiverse children and family members, kind of coined it in the 1990s, but it really over the last, I don't know, 5 years, 8 years, it's massively taken off, hasn't it, Sash? So now it's kind of everywhere, which is amazing. And it's very much about kind of, it's a movement, it's about improving rights, it's about reducing stigma, and it's also that there are other things that sometimes get linked into it. So for example, bipolar disorder and schizophrenia sometimes get linked into neurodiversity as well, to do with differences in brain functioning. So it's an approach that has been really important for lots of different people, and I think is hugely important in terms of our understanding of how human beings work. Again, different people have different reactions to this. So I also work with a lot of people who find some of the strongest campaigners of neurodiversity. So these are autistic people or neurodiverse people who find this stuff a bit too much, because for them, they do have a disability. It is debilitating, and they want that to be recognised. So again, it's a real kind of caution for anyone who's working to just be really attuned to the person you're working with, not to make assumptions about, whether they, being really pro, this is great, because actually for some people that diminishes the disabilities and difficulties they deal with on a daily basis.
I think that's a really good point, Ruth. I'm thinking about most of my autistic coaching clients, I would say it's probably about 50-50 on the whole, as to how much people engage with neurodiversity as a movement, and how many feel that actually they want to emphasize the kind of debilitating or difficult aspects of their experience of their autism.
Sure. So what we're going to do is I've just focus very briefly on a couple of kind of the aspects of the neurodiverse spectrum. But we won't go into much detail at all. So it's just to kind of highlight bits, and then we'll kind of move on to more general stuff. At the back of this presentation is a whole load of references. So if there's things that you want to find out more about, there's books, there's some YouTube, some great YouTubers, that kind of thing. So when you have a look, if there's particular things you want to go into, then just go for it. So when we're talking about the neurodiverse and the autism spectrum, there are kind of three main areas, or four main areas now. So one is differences in social communication. So that is differences in verbal and non-verbal use of language. So differences with body language, eye contact, literal speech, that kind of thing. Differences in terms of social interaction. So what feels in terms of kind of how to develop a relationship in a non-autistic way. So we always have to remember that we're framing this within, because this is based on the DSM, so we're framing this within in the context of seeing kind of non-autistic as the thing to be compared against, if that makes sense.
Yes, the sort of default common sense, which is, the approach with anything when you're looking at a marginalised group. It's always how they are determined in contrast to a perceived common sense, which is set by the majority. So it's always important to bear that in mind.
Absolutely. And a really good example of that is that previously the assumption was that autistic people didn't want to make friends. Basically, they didn't want to have social contact, and that's absolute, that's just not true. It's just that potentially the type of contact, the format, the frequency was different. There are some autistic people who don't want to have social contact, but then there are some non-autistic people who want to have minimal social contact, and sometimes I feel like that. So it varies, but there is a difficulty in terms of understanding how to develop a relationship, what it means to have a friend, what it means to have a partner, husband. The negotiation of that can be tricky, and people do find that tricky. We'll talk about it in a bit more detail later. Rigidity and repetition. So really liking consistency on the whole, struggling with change, more so than non-autistic people. Maybe has particular repetitious movements or speech or focus on interests. Sasha and I do a LGBTQ+ autism group, and we had a fabulous session on interests the other week, didn't we? Where we all spent the time, a good hour and a half, just chatting about the different amazing interests that people had. It was absolutely joyous. And then also sensory differences, which we'll go into a bit more later. So those are the four areas. And just, you'll see from the picture here that the main thing to think about is, previously we kind of thought about it as being less autistic and more autistic. And that is just a complete nonsense. Like, it just doesn't work like that. So you can have some people who have got a very high IQ, who can appear really functioning, but actually their autistic features are really autistic. It's just that you don't know. So what we think more of is the circle here, where everybody's autism manifests in slightly different ways. It's kind of a unique profile. Sash, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say it's one of the reasons why a lot of the terminology around exactly this is so problematic, because historically, and still, people talk a lot about high or low needs or high or low functioning, and actually it's often it's kind of hierarchical, and B, it's often quite dismissive of things that go on behind the scenes that people aren't necessarily privy to. So people, you know, who have issues that are more apparent to neurotypicals are more likely to be described as being low functioning, as opposed to those who maybe for whatever reason have developed you know, different camouflaging techniques, so likely to be people who are assigned female at birth, for example, who tend to camouflage better, will often be seen as higher functioning, and often as a result of that, their kind of needs and their differences won't be addressed because they're seen as being able to function, when actually there might be an awful lot going on under the surface that people just aren't aware of. Interestingly as well, it's this kind of concept of the autism spectrum is very similar to a lot of the work that's been done recently around the gender spectrum as well, that actually it's less about this kind of linear scale and more about all of these different features and this kind of much more diverse experience.
Absolutely. There's a very good movie that has come out about non-verbal autistic people called Reasons That I Jump, which is based on a book. I'd recommend that. It was lots of non-verbal autistic people were involved in the creation of it, which is super cool. And talking about the whole gender spectrum thing and autism, often neurodiversity and queerness, kind of there's a bit of a Venn diagram overlap. So you may see that within some of your clients, that they have an experience of both those things. And where I think that's relevant is that it potentially means that you've got kind of the experience of being kind of doubly marginalised potentially, and what that means. Okay, so ADHD. With this, we are looking at what we'll talk a little bit more about later. But
sorry, Ruth, can I interrupt
Yeah.
you? Why don't you put the name of the movie in the chat box before we move on to ADHD?
Got
the
it.
reason.
Good thinking.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. I can't get into the chat box at the moment.
It's all right, I'll
Very
monitor the
frustrating.
chat, dude. You're
Thank
monitoring
you.
the PowerPoint.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
monitoring the PowerPoint. We like this division of labour. Excellent. So with ADHD, we're looking at differences in the way that the brain kind of organises, plans, deals with starting tasks, starting and finishing. So it's all to do with this kind of interaction in the world and the kind of everyday functioning in that sense. And there can be two different types. So ADHD, where you've got issues with impulsivity and hyperactivity, and as well as issues with attention, and then ADD, where it's just focusing on issues with attention. There may be some kind of hyperactivity there, but it's not quite so much. A bit like as with autism, what we're seeing over the last 5 years or so is that there's probably been an underdiagnosis in girls and women, or in girls or in people assigned female at birth, because they won't necessarily behave in kind of a stereotyped way. So it's kind of just, again, have a useful bit to have in there.
Yeah, it's also something to do with the male bias in research as well. I mean, we can not just the male bias, but the male, white, straight, cisgender, middle class, the list goes on. But that again, it goes back to that notion of common sense. And so the research historically has always been done on those kinds of populations predominantly. So actually a lot of the information about other groups hasn't been included. So for example, women and girls is a really good example of people who are often misdiagnosed, or where diagnosis just doesn't happen. It's not, it's just totally missed. It's also, I know in the UK, it's historically been a big problem getting working class people having more diagnoses, and also people of colour. So a lot of the kind of awareness about these issues is kind of rooted in a particular paradigm.
Sasha, can I ask you a question about that? I've got quite a bit of it, and I have always felt that there was a very strong relationship with anxiety. And the links that I'm seeing is that in societies, the target, maybe there's a link between the targets of oppression or the different groups and the resulting anxiety from being part of those groups. Okay, I'm just drawing, I'm sucking eggs here. Or if I'm going to use a South African mixed metaphor, I'm sucking at straws. But I've always felt that my ADHD is anxiety based, and rather than neurological. And I'm wondering what sense you make of that, or am I just like off my rocker? Yeah.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, go for it.
I'll jump in. So what I would say is, depending on how your ADHD has been diagnosed, there are features to do with ADHD that would be separate from anxiety. So to do with, presence when you were younger, the way that you actually process information. So when they do an assessment with you, they'd be looking at that. However, there is a massive overlap when it comes to neurodiversity issues. So, most people who are autistic and most people who are ADHD experience anxiety. It's really common. There's a higher prevalence of anxiety, primarily anxiety, but also depression and other mental health issues within the neurodiverse population. Now, I think that's for a number of reasons. One, I think, is to do with the fact that you're in a marginalised group, and to do with the fact that the world is not built for the way that your brain works. So, it's like being a woman that I spoke to who's ADHD and autistic was like, it's like she's left-handed as well. And she's like, it's like being left-handed on steroids. It's like everything is not quite right. So one aspect is just constantly having to deal with stuff that kind of jars with you, and also having to deal with like stigma, but also the effort of having to process stuff can be really draining. So there is this overlap. And
the risk of having been bullied as well.
Yeah.
So there's often a strong link to that. Obviously, if you're neurodivergent, you're more likely to have experienced bullying from probably quite an early age, in the schoolyard, possibly even within your own family, if you don't also have a neurodivergent family.
Even if you do, unfortunately. So there's high levels of bullying, there's high levels of abuse, there's high levels of sexual violence. There's not massive amounts of stats for that sort of thing.
Sure. Kind of rings true. I always thought it was like a compensatory mechanism to, like, my anxiety came first, and my ADHD is an opportunity to manage that by not paying attention to the world.
It's really interesting. It's a really interesting thought. It could well be the case for you, Julia. It absolutely could be. It also can be a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
So if you can have underlying ADHD, which makes you more anxious, which makes you then disengage because you're anxious. So, and that exacerbating spiral is what a lot of people will present with. And that's the kind of thing that you might see actually, is someone like, I just can't finish this thing. And they've got themselves in this massive, massive spiral. And one part of that is their neurodiversity. Another part of that is their anxiety. But I'm not making any suggestions about you personally, Julia, because it could actually be the anxiety. But, you know,
useful.
yeah.
Thank you.
Alrighty. So just very briefly, so on dyspraxia. So dyspraxia is to do with coordination physically. So in terms of gross body movement, so arms, legs, moving your body, fine body movement, so handwriting, but also in terms of things like speaking. So dyspraxic people might find it quite difficult to get their words out clearly. Thinking, so being able to kind of order their thoughts, being able to order what they're doing each day. So it can have a huge issue in a number of areas. So it's just to kind of flag that one up. Dyslexia. So similarly to dyspraxia and as well, but it's not just to do with kind of reading and writing. It's also to do with things like working memory. So Sash and I have a little joke that they are my external hard drive, because I have no working memory. It is appalling, absolutely shocking. So I can't remember anything, I really can't. So I will message Sash and be like, did I do this? And they'll be like, yep, you did it. You've just done it and forgotten it. And that happens remarkably frequently. So also, you know, being able to orientate, time management, organization, rapid naming, which is the bit that you struggle with when you get kind of like, you know, dementia and things like that, so not being able to name something, forgetting your words. So, and it's just interesting to think about what this means in terms of a person's experience at work, at college, in the family, relationship-wise, you know, how that impacts the way they are, how that might impact the situations in things that they'll come to you with. Alrighty, executive functioning. So this is one of the things that we see across all of the spectrum. Okay, it's one of the areas of difference. So again, I will caveat this with the fact that executive functioning is a medicalized term, and it's slightly, it's kind of pathologizing the nature of it, but it's useful to think about because it's true. I know it's true for me. So it's the aspect of our thinking that's all to do with like organization. So it's like your brain's personal system. So it's all of that kind of organization stuff. So working memory, being self-aware, planning, being able to start tasks, organizing yourself, controlling your impulses. So, you know, being able to resist that second glass of wine or third or second bottle, you know, all of those things. Being able to control your emotions. So that's another part of it, being able to manage your emotions and think flexibly. And in various different ways, people who are neurodiverse will experience differences or difficulties with these things. And what that means is that, you know, everyday stuff can be really challenging. You get overwhelmed by your emotions. You are incredibly bright, but you cannot manage to get your work done in time. And everybody thinks you're lazy, or everybody thinks you're careless, you know, and often those labels that people have come from school. Yeah. And so you kind of get, and Sash, do you want to jump in here? Because I'm sure it's really relevant with a lot of the coaching people you see.
Well, yeah, I mean, often things around self-monitoring come up, particularly in coaching, because obviously you're inviting people to have that self-reflective space and to identify how they're feeling about stuff. And actually it can be really particularly difficult for neurodivergent people to even do that check-in. So this is one of the reasons why coaching in some ways can be much more appropriate than psychotherapy for autistic people, because the less focus on the kind of emotional content and using that sort of emotional language and checking in about feelings on that kind of level can be much easier. So getting them to check in different ways that are kind of more tangible, that are less conceptual, that rely less on being able to use that kind of language. I mean, the same is true for sort of basic bodily things as well. So this isn't just self-monitoring on an emotional level, it's also physiological. So for example, people might find it very difficult to explain to a doctor what their experience of their pain is like. So they might go to a doctor because they're experiencing quite severe pain, but actually when the doctor asks them to describe that pain, they can't. They can't identify it in the same way that we might expect a neurotypical person to do. Or, you know, being able to tell when you're thirsty or you're hungry or you need the toilet, things like that can be really difficult. So part of it is that working with the person to develop strategies in which they can check in with themselves in a way that makes sense for them, rather than kind of trying to plug away and get them to do that in the way that it's kind of, I guess, more average for people to do. I will say as well, when we shared this in our autistic support group, everybody was, you know, engaging with the content and really kind of coming up with so many examples of these issues playing out in different ways. But one of the other things that came up was just the sheer confusion about the way this infographic is presented. So there was a lot of, what is the rationale behind the colours? Why do some of them have the same colour? What's the significance of that? And it was just like, it was just such a great example of the kind of autistic sensibility of like, what is the rationale behind it? Because it doesn't make sense.
Rationale. There's no rationale. Clearly someone's just thought these colours look pretty and it's just put them in. Yeah. And they're like, why is this? Why is two? There isn't any. It's just done randomly. Beautiful. It's like, oh yeah. but you're right, it really got stuck with them, didn't it? And it did. And it was a really good example.
It's great.
It's really busy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really busy and really nonsensical.
Yeah,
it is.
And I think they were picking up on things like why the little icon illustration things are in different quadrants of the squares as well. There's so much about it, the design, that sort of doesn't make logical sense, that people were really picking up on. Ruth, there's a question in the chat around speech and language disorders, and the link to that. So an example of the movie The King's Speech, dealing with George the Fifth's speech issues, fifth, I don't know, whatever.
Fifth, I want to say fifth.
I hate Roman numerals.
So what was the question?
Just around the link between neurodivergence and speech and language development.
So it depends. If we're talking about stuttering isn't necessarily a neurodevelopmental condition. That can be linked to other things. It can just be totally separate, and the individual's just had difficulties in developing their speech. It may be linked to anxiety, it may be linked to trauma, but there can be overlaps. So for example, it's not uncommon for neurodiverse people to have issues around stuttering or issues around speech, for example, with dyspraxia, or with some of the other ones, because it's to do with coordination, being able to actually coordinate your mouth. Tourette's, obviously, can often have verbal tics. That isn't necessarily the same as stuttering. So it can overlap, but there are also differences between the two. I'll leave that.
I think we've got a raised hand as well.
We have a raised hand, which is very exciting. Karen, ask your question.
Hi there. Yes, thank you. So my question is, you brought this up around when you were talking about ADHD, and you mentioned around brainstorming. So I was just fascinated. I think, Sasha, you started talking about how to engage with people who have these issues in a different way. Are you saying that brainstorming is easier or less easy for somebody with ADHD?
I think it really depends on the presentation of the ADHD. Like, I'm thinking of, this isn't an ADHD example, but I'm thinking of a kind of compare and contrast, I guess, between two of my long-term autistic coaching clients in terms of the way that is more helpful for them to process and to generate ideas about stuff. And I've got one who wants absolutely no intervention from me at all. It's literally about me being there for him to kind of talk at me and come to his own conclusions about stuff. And if I try to intervene too much, it kind of interrupts his thought pattern, and he can't, it distracts him and kind of derails him. So for him, it's less about brainstorming and more about him kind of just being able to, I don't know, I think, well, probably info dump, essentially, which is a term that is used often with autistic people. So that process of just kind of getting everything out there, it's very much that for him. But then in contrast, I've got another one who just his verbal processing isn't, I mean, it's fine, but it's not his strongest way of processing. So he's extremely visual. And so what works for him is to get a whiteboard up on the screen and to doodle what's been going on. And even if that has sort of verbal elements to it, so it might be that he's making flowcharts or something, but it's got to be done in that way. And you know, for him, it's about kind of finding the narrative of what's going on almost, which for the other client would be completely inappropriate. It wouldn't make sense to him. So I think with all of this, it's kind of one of the things to emphasize, and I guess it's the same with any client group, is that it's so variable. It's so variable. And I think the temptation, particularly with things like neurodivergence, is to think that there's a particular different way in which that person's brain is working, and therefore we have to work in that way. And actually, it's so much more unique and varied than that. So it's very much about helping them to identify what really hits the spot for them, and allowing that space within the session to explore that, and to not enforce things or say, this is the way that we're going to do it, or this is the way that works for other people, or just really allowing that space. I can see there's another raised hand, Christine.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, because this graphic was making me think about using graphics, because recently I worked with a client and we use graphical harvesting. We use text word coming through, plus we had the normal PowerPoint. So we had about 4 or 5 different formats of the way the information was going up. And it was interesting because the graphical harvesting worked really well. People really liked it. And it actually then opened up a discussion for some people sharing about neurodiversity in the group, which was the first time I've had to deal with that in the group variety. And yeah, it's just that you cannot, if we just done the PowerPoints, we just done the graphic, we just done that, we wouldn't have had that level of richness. Or the level of a space that became safe that people could share. And it was not my intention. It was just a reflection that what I've learned from doing that. And
that's
having more
really
than one technique.
Good reflection, and something that kind of clarifies, I guess, where I was coming from in responding, which I think is that one of the privileges of doing one-to-one work, particularly with neurodivergent clients, is that allowing them to have the space to figure out what works for them, rather than having something kind of thrust upon them, or particularly, other people's expectations, often parental expectations or teachers' expectations, whether or not they're a young person. Those things have such an impact. And a lot of the kind of neurodivergent experience is around that being shoehorned into a particular way of working that doesn't necessarily work for you. And a lot of the time they will have developed some sort of coping strategy in order to kind of meet those expectations, but actually they can't flourish in that way, and they don't necessarily know what works best for them, because they haven't necessarily had anybody sit down and open it up and say, let's look at how your brain works, let's look at what makes sense to you. So there is a bit of unlearning, I think, that has to happen often with neurodivergent clients, that kind of questioning what they've been told about the way in which they must do something.
And I think it's so, sorry, it's
Yeah,
like
carry
it's
on.
not empowered sometimes to ask, because I think the reason I was allowed to do that work was because one of the senior directors was open to it. And he said, my staff, I have nurses, my staff does that. And because he opened the avenue, and then allowed them to say, actually, we really like that. Can we do that next time and do that next time?
Fantastic.
So, and it's not just about empowerment, because it shouldn't have to ask for something that the world should be able to give you, but it does help if there's somebody who can open the avenue, or you can open the avenue.
Absolutely.
That's wonderful, Christine. What I'd add into that is, what can be useful is just having in your mind the types of things that might be helpful, the variation that there might be. So the client may work better with written stuff or with graphic stuff. Let's see. They may struggle remembering stuff and planning. Okay, let's see. And then, so because there is so much variation, for me, it's just like having these thoughts in my mind that this may be a difference. Let me check it out with them. Yeah. And that way you can kind of have this kind of to and fro where you can figure out what's right, and knowing that there are just these particular areas where it's likely there may be some kind of difference. So
yeah,
awesome.
There can be some embarrassment around that as well, I think, with the kind of organizational stuff. So a feeling that they've been told that they should be able to organize a certain aspect of their lives, but for some reason it just can't happen, and there can be a lot of shame around that. So just being able to I guess normalize that and say, this isn't a failing on your part, it's just nobody's given you the tools to figure out how to deal with this particular aspect of your life. It might be something like using a calendar to book in things like when you're likely to need to trim your toenails, or get book a haircut or something like that, because it's not something that they will just remember to do or think to do or plan for. So yeah, there's something around sort of shame busting and normalizing whatever their particular reality is, rather than feeling that they have to conform.
Absolutely. Julia, go for it.
Marks, you had your hand up. Not your blue hand, but your real hand.
I did. And I'm sort of taking a little bit back in the conversation. I'm hearing you say very strongly, there are no general rules, and every client presents differently. But you did talk about the sort of coaching modality that sort of teaches to self-observe, and you sort of said we need to be doing that differently. And I'd love you to just give us an example. I'd love to just hear what's an example of how one could do that differently in a way that builds a competence.
So I think it kind of goes back really to a lot of the stuff that Ruth was saying around testing out different things so that you can figure out what works for them. So like often as practitioners, we'll have particular ways that we, I guess, rely on to get people to self-reflect or to check in with themselves. So it might be that for one person that's around embodiment, so they might do some sort of body scan or something that really tunes into that. For others it might be around imagery, so using some sort of possibly a focusing technique or a guided meditation or something like that. I guess it's about having lots of different tools in your kit that you can try out with people to try and find what's going to work for them. And I think that's good practice anyway as practitioners. It's just that you're less likely to have to do that if there's kind of I guess less divergence within your client group. It's easier to kind of fall into those I don't know, fail-safe kind of practices. So I think it's just about having a sort of arsenal of different things that you can use, and really trying to tune into what the client is bringing, rather than trying to then enforce something on that, because it can be really uncomfortable if you're working with an autistic client who just doesn't experience the world in a kind of physical way, who isn't necessarily too tuned into that, or who might have sensory issues that are kicking off at that particular moment, and you're just kind of inviting them to go into this embodied work. The impact of that could be really, it could be either that you just get nothing back from it because it doesn't mean anything to them and they just can't process in that way, or it might even open up a load of stuff that they don't want to open up. So if they're dealing with some sort of sensory issue at that time, you're going to open up this kind of bodily awareness that might be quite overwhelming for them. So I think in general, probably with autistic clients, I'm less likely to invite them to do something. I'm much more likely to sit and listen to what they bring or what they tell me that they need. And a lot of it actually is about making them comfortable to do that, to be able to tell me what they need, because they've likely trained themselves to turn that off because they've been told that it's not appropriate.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Dash. Just jumping in, is that all right?
Yeah, go for it.
Interrupting you. To give you a concrete example as well, that's slightly, so I absolutely agree. I think it's so important to creating a space where they feel able to start to explore that stuff is vital. I think it's foundational for everyone that you work with. I work with a guy who is incredibly high up in some type of tech. I don't really know what. It's very impressive. I don't understand any of it. And one of the things that we were dealing with was issues at work, and he was not aware of what was going on at work at all. So where you might say, let's talk about what's going on at work. How are you feeling? What are you noticing? He didn't have a framework for that. He found it very difficult to do that self-reflection, and he also struggled to pick up on what was happening with his colleagues around him. So initially, I gave specific questions. So we talked about it. He was like, I'm not sure, I don't really know. And I was like, okay, so what happens when you do this? Or give me the last situation when it ended up in an argument or disagreement. And we would go through it kind of in royal detail, trying to map out what was going on. Then I spoke to him about, okay, well, next time you're at work, be mindful about people's body language. Notice if they do this, this, and this. Or, if someone asks you this question, that's something to be aware of. So initially it was a case of working that all out with him, giving him some real structure as to what he could look at and and the questions he could ask himself. How am I feeling? What thoughts are going through my head? Over the years, I've been working with this guy for a long time. He's started doing that himself much more. So he's kind of overtly learned that self-reflection that some people find easier than others. So that's the thing that can also be useful is you can kind of getting them feeling comfortable, and then potentially you can kind of give footholds and handholds that they can then kind of learn.
I think that's a really good point around the kind of almost helping people to design basically a crib sheet of questions that they can ask themselves in a situation that's confusing, but questions that make sense for them, questions that don't come from me as a practitioner. So and often that will be based on their values, clarifying what their values are in a particular situation. So I've got one client at the moment who has a lot of, and I mean really a lot of interpersonal challenges, and he's very aware of those. He's quite aware that that he can be quite what's the right word, not necessarily aggressive, but challenging, a real kind of pushing back to anything that is authority or hierarchical, because that's his belief system. And that's fine, that makes sense to him, and it's not up to me to try and change that. But it can be really helpful for him developing a few questions that he can ask himself when he's trying to negotiate one of those situations. So when he is feeling frustrated with someone for, you know, behavior that he perceives as perhaps arrogant or patronizing, is often that, where he can check in and remind himself of what his values are in that situation. So what does he want to get out of that conflict, so that he can manage it in a way that makes sense to him. So, you know, we've done a lot of work on thinking about what that would mean for him, what's important for him in a conflict like that. And actually there's a lot about him, you know, kind of balancing that tension between him wanting to be what he would call a good person, and be fair. It's very much about fairness and justice, but also by the same token, a part of that justice being that he will stand up for himself. And that's very, very important to him. And the problem that he often has when talking through those things with other people is the message that they'll give him is, oh, just suck it up. You have to learn how to play the game. Or, you know, you have to deal with these things sometimes. It's just immaturity. But it's not just immaturity, it's his value system, and that's just as valid as any other value system. So it's very much about doing the work for people to be able to identify what that value system is in the same way that you would with a neurotypical client. But it's just, I think often with neurotypical clients, the kind of opposition to that value system, and they're trying to mold it into a different value system, is perhaps more pertinent. And there's a bit more undoing and kind of allowing someone to feel comfortable and justified in that position, and giving them the space to think about what that means on a practical level in terms of, you know, dealing with situations where those values are pushed up against or challenged in some way.
Absolutely. I noticed that Steph has put her hand up, but also they've left in a it feels very so I'm going to say something briefly, and then when Steph comes back we can ask them their question. So just very briefly on communication, because I think this is useful to bear in mind. I mean, this is for autistic people as opposed to neurodiverse. But for autistic people there can be a real specificity around speech. We've mentioned that for some individuals non-verbal, so either written or images is more helpful. Sometimes this can be to do with it taking longer to process verbal information, and they may struggle interpreting body language. They may give off different body language. They may look aggressive when actually they're anxious. So it's just being mindful around how clear are you being in your speech? You know, how is there directiveness? Is there how direct they are? Is that getting misinterpreted either by you or by others? So it's just kind of having a quick awareness of that. Steph and Ingrid, I've noticed. I think both of you had questions, so go for it.
Thank you. I apologize that I've only come into this whole session about 10 minutes ago. I am working with a high-functioning autistic guy, and he came to me for relationship coaching. So we've had 3 sessions so far, so I'm still very new into this relationship with him. And so he didn't tell me at the first session that he had any challenges at all. And he wrote to me 2 weeks later and said, I do want to book a second session, and I need you to know that this is my diagnosis. And the reason that I didn't tell you was I didn't want you to filter anything different. I wanted to know that I was safe. So that said, he's booked a second, and we've had a third session. And the big issue for him is his marriage relationship. Mm-hmm. So the question, and I normally work in my practice is predominantly in the couple and family space. So my question is around what he told me this last session was that because I've been working with learning from him what have been his coping skills till now, and what are the challenges that are emerging now, and we do talk about work and social life as well as his personal relationship, but the key question that I want to ask is, he is saying that his wife gets very irate, that everything is written in his diary. So even the phone call at 11:30 when she's going to be having her coffee break is in his diary. And I'm thinking, this is great. He's got a reminder to phone his wife, which means he can show up. She's flipping because she sees herself as just another date in the diary, another appointment in the diary. So from the folk that are here, and Sasha, as I say, I dived in 10 minutes ago, so I'm gathering you're the key speaker here, is any information that would assist me as being brand new into this situation.
Sure.
I have worked with children with autism and quite high functioning autistic children with autism. But this is the first time I've been working with an adult in any context, and then specifically this context. So any information, input, I would appreciate. Thank you.
My pleasure. Steph, I'm going to jump in, and then Sash, you can follow up if that's all right. So I do a lot of work with autistic couples and families, and I think the issue that you're highlighting here is a really common one, which is that the spouse or the partner is struggling with the person's diagnosis, the person's difference. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. Him writing stuff down in the diary is fabulous. I work with other people, and we talk about this. Part of what might be the next piece is actually chatting to him about how his wife understands his autism. Has he spoken to her about it? Have they had a conversation where he says, just because I write it down doesn't mean that I don't care. This is my way of showing you that I care. And explaining why, explaining the fact that I struggle to remember things, and it's just not clear to me to keep on top of this stuff. So me writing it down is my way of saying that I love you. So there's something about kind of exploring with him what's going on in the dynamic between him and his wife, what his wife knows and understands about his autism and how that works, and then potentially facilitating him in making a conversation where they're able to actually develop that understanding together, and go from there. So that is something that that whole thing takes a lot of time sometimes. That the spouse unpacking it all, and that was it. The last thing I'll just mention, and then I'll shut up, is because I've a number of people who mention it, saying that his wife's really irate. So one of the things that's not uncommon for autistic people, and also across the spectrum, so some ADHD people might experience this too, is experiencing other people's emotions massively intensely. So again, there's a kind of, there's a complete myth about, autistic people not being emotional. It's absolute bollocks, pardon my French. A lot of them are super, super sensitive. And so they'll see someone who's being a bit missed as really angry. That may not be the case with your person, Steph. It may be that she is really irate. Fair enough. But it's just to kind of pop that in there, that's not uncommon. And relationship-wise, that's always a nice thing to listen out for, because that can help to unpick with them if that's going on.
He's definitely inferring that his perception is that she is like off the scale, and his response is to shut down and disappear. So the sensory response is he's very attuned to that. So thank you, that's very, very helpful.
So my sense with a lot of these issues is that these are issues that any relationship has, but that often become more acute, more obvious when there's a difference in you know, to this degree, to the kind of people's actual experience of the world on this level. So, you know, a lot of people talk about things like the love languages. You know, there's that book, I can't remember who wrote it, but it's quite a sort of basic concept, but it's quite useful in terms of thinking about people's relationships. So how we express love differently, and the fact that we kind of often expect other people to use the same romantic languages. So if we're somebody who expresses love through performing tasks for people, we will often only see that aspect of someone's communication as an expression of their love for us, when actually they might be doing something that's more meaningful to them. So, you know, they might be somebody who buys a gift to express love. So there is something about that just really clarifying how each individual expresses love, and having a kind of an open dialogue about that, so that they understand that, and they understand, you know, things that they might be able to do to express their love differently to that person as well, so that there's a real understanding of the different perspectives that they come from. Now, I think this is more acute when you're looking at autistic relationship. There was a brilliant meme that I wish I could find and just share with you now, where somebody somebody did a kind of alternative 5 love languages for autistic people, and it was things like, I saw an interesting rock and I took it home to show you. So I think the way in which those things are expressed romantically is likely to be quite different between an autistic person and a neurotypical person. Just the kind of sensibility about what expresses that is likely to be different. So really clarifying how that expression of love is being communicated is so important for anybody, but particularly for those couples where that difference is likely to be broader.
Absolutely, absolutely. Right, I'm gone. Oops, oh no. Okay. Oh, this is perfect. This is just what we were talking about. So with some of my, again, this is predominantly autistic clients as opposed to other aspects of the spectrum. Okay, so we're talking about autistic clients here. One of my clients spoke about it like there's this kind of neurotypical Wi-Fi where neurotypical people are all tuned into each other. Like I can look at someone and be like, oh, okay, they're a bit angry. And for autistic people, it's like you're just missing out on that Wi-Fi. You're not tuned in. So you can't tell why your wife's angry. You kind of sense that she's a bit annoyed, but you can't put all the pieces together. And that's because of difficulties with understanding body language, picking up kind of nonverbal cues. So just to kind of flag that up, I'm going to rattle through these next ones because I want to get to the stuff which is about techniques. So this is to do with, we've touched on this already, but the ability to kind of hyper-focus or to think about things in a more overarching way. And generally, although it varies, autistic people might be more tend to hyper-focus on things. Dyslexics often are better at the overall, so it kind of varies, but it's just something useful to think about because that can impact how they are. Here's a little quick one for you. Whether you can find the triangle in the buggy and the house thing in the rocking horse. How quickly can you find that? Again, what this is a test about whether you see things overall, so whether you're looking at the whole picture or whether you tend to see things in details and in parts. So it's just to kind of get you thinking. I won't go, we could talk about sensory differences for like forever, but just in terms of sensory wise, there can be lots of different profiles, and that might include things like interception, which is knowing what's going on in my body. Sash mentioned that earlier, so being able to pick up pain. Proprioception, knowing where the body is in space, and that can have a massive impact on everything. And lots of adults, obviously the same with kids, but lots of adults who may come to you and have had a later diagnosis may not realise that actually it could be a sensory issue that's causing a difficulty they're having at work or in their relationship or something like that. So it's one to kind of keep your ears open for. So feeling too overloaded can lead to, in your case, Steph, you were talking about he just shut down and goes away, or it can lead to massive explosions, or it can lead to complete exhaustion. And again, it's quite useful to bear in mind, because if they find, I mean, it can be really extreme. So someone just can't speak anymore, like they literally can't. Or it could be that they're having lots of arguments and totally losing it, and people are like, what the hell is going on with you? And actually what we've got here is an issue of being completely overloaded, but they're not even aware. Well, here we go. Right, interception. Again, Sasha's mentioned this. So interception is also linked to knowing how you feel. Knowing how you feel and being able to communicate it. So lots of autistic people and across the spectrum can struggle knowing how they feel. Another word for this is alexithymia. Alexithymia, knowing how I feel emotionally and in my body physically, isn't just linked to autism. It can be broader than that, but it often overlaps. Now, this obviously is important, because if we're trying to get people to reflect and trying to get them to really think about how they're feeling, they may literally not be able to sense it. So individuals that I speak to will be like, I don't know, it just feels wobbly, or I just feel bad, or I don't know at all, I feel numb. And it's only when we explore that we're able to kind of pick out what's going on. I'm going to keep moving. Yeah, I am going to. Okay, I'll go back. I want to show you this one. Okay, so this was created by an autistic person and put on Reddit for everybody to use. And this is their way of figuring out their emotions. Okay, so you've got a scale, also Lego, amazing. So you've got a scale from 0 to 10. Everything is awesome. If you haven't seen the movie, I recommend it. It's delightful. All the way up to meltdown is imminent, okay? And what they've also done is they've linked it to physiological responses. So for lots of people, if they struggle with their emotions, their first go-to that's slightly easier can be physical. So I don't know how I'm feeling, and I'll say to my client, okay, what's your shoulders like? Are they tense? Where are your hands? Are your hands scrunched up, or are they loose? So that can help them to start unpicking this. You also may look at behavior. I don't know how I'm feeling, but I'm pacing around the house. I don't know how I'm feeling, but I'm swearing. I don't know how I'm feeling, but I'm sweating. So all of these things can become parts of a puzzle that you could help them to put together, and then you can link it with strategies. And you'll see here that all of the strategies are super practical, you know, journaling, take 5, take your medication, that kind of stuff. And this kind of work I do a lot. And then it can be the foundation. So you might start off with something like this if someone's really struggling, and then you're able to tackle issues at work, issues with the family, whatever it may be, what they want to do in life. Just because it's linked, forgive me, I'm blocking about, but also in terms of emotions, this little thermometer can be quite helpful, and getting other people to help them. So, you know, ask your wife when she thinks you're annoyed, ask your brother, you know, ask your housemates, ask your colleagues, do they notice when you're getting slightly stressed? Other people may notice, and that can help put the picture together. Linking it, go on. Yeah, go for it, Sasha.
I was just going to say, I think another really good way of exploring all of these things that's kind of it works across the board is trying to link them to that person's special interest if they have a special interest, because often you know, they'll have such an intense special interest that really helps them make sense of the world. So it's not just that it's interesting to them, it's actually that it's a really useful lens to look at anything through. So for example, I'm thinking of myself. Let's self-disclose here. So I'm a gamer. A lot of my special interests are around computer games. And I went through a phase where, because I struggle with that interception thing of detecting what my needs are, actually using the kind of system from The Sims to check in was super helpful for me. Because I could think about what are all those bars on The Sims that you have to monitor as the person who's in charge of them all. How's my bladder? How's my hunger? How's my comfort? How's my fun? You know, all of those things. So finding a way to link it into their particular special interest can be a really, really helpful thing to do, because it just immediately makes more sense to them.
Absolutely.
It's a wealth of resource there that people just don't use enough with autistic clients.
Totally. And it you know, and that's something that's really important actually, is like finding out what it is. So whenever I work with people in that first session, I will specifically ask them, what are you into? Is there anything you're massively into? I want to know. And they might then spend the rest of the session talking to me about that. That's fine, because then we can use that later on. Christine, I noticed your hand's up. Go for it.
Yeah, it's just a reflection. I have a neurodiverse son, maybe two, and a lot of what you're sharing here is what I've learned as a mother. And actually what I didn't realize, and I suppose I should, is how much maybe some of that has moved into my coaching, because it makes sense. If you understand how to work with a neurodiverse child, you understand it's the same. So yeah. We have our version of that Lego man in our house.
I love
Particularly
it.
that.
Excellent.
And I use it as well. It works for me. You know, when we're out somewhere, and I'll just point out that little, we got one that goes red, but I'm heading towards the red man. So yeah.
I love that, and I think, you know, that's wonderful, Christine. And that, to me, that also highlights another point, which is, you know, these techniques are useful for anyone. So you can talk about it with them, but they can do it at home. They can get their partners doing it, their kids doing it. They can get people at work doing it. And again, there being no shame. Like, you know, I have to use numerous different techniques to help keep me kind of, you know, upright and functioning. And it's that taking shame away from that. I love that. It's really cool. Just because it's connected. So another element that can be really helpful in terms of exploring emotions, as Sasha was mentioning earlier, a lot of neurodiverse clients have massively strong values, and that is a really important thing for them. Sasha, actually, do you want to chat more about this? Go for it.
Yeah, so this is Emmy Vanderzin's emotional compass, which is just kind of a way of making sense of emotions and the kind of potential flow of emotions, although there is no assumption in this that everybody follows the same kind of emotional patterns at all. But it's particularly about linking emotion to values and thinking about emotion in that way. So and that's particularly true when we look, obviously, at emotions that people tend to try to bat away or are uncomfortable about experiencing. So things like anger, for example, or fear. So on this compass, you can see there's kind of 4 quadrants. So you've got from 12 to 3 is kind of pride, confidence, arrogance, jealousy, worry, vigilance. These are all things around perceiving a threat to a value, a potential threat to a value that we hold dear. Then the next quadrant, you get the kind of despair, fear, sorrow, resignation. Those are likely to be experienced when we have lost that value, when that something about that value isn't being upheld. So it's a response to that kind of that loss. And then you've got the kind of reconnection to the value. So the next bit around desire, envy, curiosity, aspiration. It's that sense of, oh, I might be able to gain this. I might be able to move more closely towards this value that I hold dear. And then the final quadrant is that kind of that sense of gaining, that sense of having moved towards that value. And of course, these are always in flux. You know, one thing goes well and we feel connected to a value that we hold, and then something goes wrong and we lose it again. And we'll find ourselves at different points in this kind of spectrum of emotions. And some people will find that there are bits of this that they just don't really experience that much, or bits where they find they are kind of situated in very often, like maybe they find themselves in, you know, this experience of despair a lot, but they find it difficult to feel anger. So we all have different emotional patterns, and it's not about kind of predicting what those are, but it's a way of linking that emotional experience to our value system in order to understand what the purpose of the emotion is, how we can use the emotion to kind of make choices about how we move forward, rather than trying to sort of shut it down and always move it towards this notion of, you know, that that sunny, happy quadrant in the yellow, orangey area where we all want to be all the time, but we can't. So there is something about being able to sit with our emotion and understand what it's telling us, understand the message of it, understand why something has angered us so much. You know, what is it about that that's really upset us? What is the threat there? And therefore, what is it that we're holding dear, and what is it that we need to protect? What are we being invited to protect in that situation? And this can be, I mean, this is useful for anybody, but I think it's particularly useful in working with neurodivergent clients who might find it harder to have just the purely emotional talk, the purely feelings-based talk in a way that a neurotypical person might find it easier to do. And it concretizes and makes logical the experience of emotion as well, which can be really, really helpful, especially in monitoring that really strong emotion when it comes through as well. Because, you know, as Ruth was saying, there's this myth that autistic people are like robots and we don't feel emotion and we're just logical, and that's absolute nonsense. Actually, that a lot of the sort of experiences in romantic relationships as well, where one party is neurotypical and one party is autistic, it often kind of really breaks that stereotype, in the sense that often it will be the autistic partner who is much more emotional and much more expressive about those emotions, to the point where often the neurotypical partner can get really overwhelmed by it and feel like, oh, just calm down, you know, I don't understand what all this is about. So, but being able to then sort of have that logical understanding of what's going on in the emotion, why they're feeling that emotion and what it's calling them to do, can be really helpful in terms of them making a choice about where to go from there. And often it's that bit that can become very overwhelming, because the emotion, the experience of the emotion is so intense that it can be very, very difficult to kind of make sense of it. So helping them to do that, helping them to draw connections between their emotional experience and their kind of value system and their sense of justice or rightness, or, you know, all of those kind of very spiritual value-based things that often they will have a real connection to and a real understanding of, just makes this emotional navigation a little bit easier. Which, absolutely, wouldn't we all like everything to be a little bit easier?
So just on this note, one of the things that kind of linked to, or to be mindful of, is also in terms of kind of embodiment, what their sensory profile might be. So very practical things like if they are ADHD, ADD, dyspraxic, actually, you know, moving can be really helpful in processing information or speaking. You know, being explicit about that. You know, it's okay if if you're sitting with them, if they're moving around or standing up, obviously whatever you're comfortable with. But for me, for example, I will mention that in my sessions. You know, if you need to stand up, if you need to move, if you need to kind of, you know, if you've got fiddles that you need to use, that's absolutely fine. And I can do that in a way also that's not necessarily like, I can just say, look, if you feel uncomfortable with lights or anything, let me know. So you don't need to kind of make it, you can make it something that you could say to anyone, but it's just to kind of be mindful of those differences. And again, take away the shame of it. So it's okay for them to do that if they need to. Some examples of various sensory stuff that can be really helpful. And then Phenomenological Investigation is an existential tool. I'll let you talk about this mainly, Sash, but and I think both of us have found just naturally that it's extremely helpful when working with neurodiverse clients. It's the foundation, like, for everyone. You can use it with everybody, but there is something about the approach that it allows you to take when you're working with neurodiverse individuals that I think is really helpful. But Sash, do you want to explain more?
So it's very much about, so phenomenology, obviously, well, not obviously, I hate it when people just throw in an obviously and it's not obvious. slight detour there. Phenomenology, meaning the science of phenomena. So really looking at what the phenomena is that's unfolding, or what the phenomena is that the client is describing to you, and focusing on that rather than focusing on a kind of specific intervention that you're going to make, or a particular framework for understanding that experience or making sense of that experience. It's literally about going down to just investigating in as much detail as possible what it is that they're describing. So it's really mainly about eliciting as rich description as possible. So being able to sit with them and just openly exploring their experience of the world. So not trying to explain it, not trying to interpret what it is that they're saying, but really just sitting with the phenomenon in the purest, cleanest way that you possibly can. And a lot of that, of course, is about testing our assumptions. A lot of that is about just being open and curious and asking for as much description as possible, and also allowing for ambiguity. So understanding that in any situation, in any phenomena that's being described, there will be tensions, there will be conflicts, there will be things that don't make sense. There will be, on the one hand, I love this person, but on the other hand, they irritate me so much, and I can feel both at the same time, and many other things at the same time. That really opening up what their experience is at all of these different levels, and trying to help them to make sense of what their lived experience is. So really moving away from frameworks or tools or anything like that can be a much more comfortable place to sit in as a practitioner, and just looking at the phenomenon, just looking at the description, and knowing that if you sit with that description and you really help that person to verbalize that and to explore it, you will come to so many interesting conclusions, so many interesting ideas about how to move forward or what's important in that particular situation, that you really don't need those sort of frameworks and tools in order to get lots of good work out of that discussion. Ingrid, you've got your hand up. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, thanks so much. I think what you've just said is one of the most important things ever. And if anyone's going to take anything away, I think what you've just said is the most important, is not to come with your frameworks and tools and models and assumptions and 5 steps and to tell someone their experience, because I think that's part of the problem with autistic people's whole life, is having been invalidated and needing to mask against normative criteria, and not having their sensory issues respected, etc., etc. And to be with what is, without your diagnostic categories or saying, oh, well, that's a feature of. And I see that as a big danger with the Enneagram, because somebody says, you know, I felt really depressed, and then the coach says, oh, well, that's the line to 2. It's incredibly infuriating for most people, but I think specifically for someone who's neurodivergent, and even more intensified if it's a neurotypical therapist or counselor. Like, you don't know. So shush. And be with what is, what's arising in the moment. So I really love what you're saying. I think that's very, very important. And also, I think what I might have put in the chat earlier, that the overlap with what's called ODD diagnostically, which is a kind of opposition to being controlled and defined, and resisting impositions, resisting other people's paradigms, and feeling the entitlement to say, you know what, that's a psychodynamic paradigm and I'm a Jungian, so fuck off with your paradigm. But I think that one, as a therapist, if you've got the depth and presence and confidence, you're going to have to allow a neurodivergent person to argue with you about your assumptions. And if you can't do that and you're clinging to your tools, you're not going to be able to work with that person because they'll experience you as very inauthentic and shallow. And if there's anything I find neurodiverse people value, it's truthful, authentic presence. So I just love what you're emphasizing there about frameworks. Thank you.
And
Thank you, Ingrid.
I just want to back that up from the ADHD perspective. I spent my life fighting toolkits, and it's because they invalidate me. Even the Enneagram gets my goat. Because it fundamentally it's built by neurotypical people, and I can't get my head around it. Most of them. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you both. Yeah, thank you both so much for sharing that. I couldn't agree with both of you more. I really couldn't. You know, I think the most important thing is that being with and fully immersing yourself in their world.
Yeah.
And making sure that you are not, reshaming in any way. And the authentic thing. I think that's key. We'll go more about that later.
I was just going to add to that, like the amount of self-disclosure that I do usually is higher when I'm working with neurodivergent clients, because frankly, you can't take the same approach that you would in a therapeutic or coaching setting that you would with a neurotypical client, where they might ask you a question, a personal question, or what you think about something, and you can just say, something that bats it back at them, where you're basically saying, well, it's not really about what I think, or, questioning why that's important to them or whatever. You can't do that. You can't do that with a neurodivergent client, because they'll just see you as a bullshitter. And frankly, rightly so, because it's kind of stupid hierarchical thing. They're sharing all of this stuff with you, and you can't even answer a question about. Do you know what I mean? I think it's worth questioning some of these paradigms. Now, I think there are problems obviously around self-disclosure. If the intention of the practitioner is just to take up space or to put themselves into it, then that's a problem, and that should never happen. But if you self-disclosing is going to help the relationship because somebody has asked you to do that, and it will enable them to see you as more real, or possibly even to kind of check back as a sort of measure of their own experience, like to measure it against yours in some way, then it's fine. It's absolutely fine.
I'm the same as you, Sasha. So I do a lot of self-disclosure with my autistic and neurodiverse clients. The thing I would say is there isn't the bullshit, there isn't the game playing, or there's much less of it. And what that means is that I can have a really open conversation and explain, I've got my boundaries. I'm not going to tell you everything because you don't want to know everything, because this is your time. And if I'm talking about all my stuff, it clutters that up. But if you ask me a direct question, I can see where you're coming from. I'm going to answer that.
Yeah.
So I feel I suppose what I'm getting at here is that you can disclose in a way where you feel comfortable. And if I don't feel comfortable saying something, I will just explain to them, I understand why you're asking me that. I actually don't feel comfortable. This is why. What else, how else can we tackle this?
Yeah, and usually they'll really appreciate that as well, because you're being really straightforward and open about the reasons why you're doing something. Exactly. And they won't take offense in the same way that that you might expect a neurotypical to take offense at that kind of interaction. There's a lot more, basically, if you're honest and you're open and authentic.
Yeah,
pretty
absolutely.
much.
It's so fundamental, isn't it? It's that being authentic, being real, because you're helping them to understand themselves and yourself and relatedness and being with other people. You're also modeling what it means to be in a safe relationship, which, as we've mentioned, a lot of them may not have experienced because of shame and abuse and bullying, all this kind of stuff. Also, as I said, you know, there's generally speaking just a lot more directness. There isn't any of the kind of, they don't want any of the social flim-flam fluffiness. It's not required, and it's a joy. It is a joy, I have to say. I love it. Okay, I'm noticing the time, and so I just thought I would flick through a couple and then probably have time for some questions, but we've touched on most of these things. So just in terms of like sharing education, giving information, so it might be about explaining how their neurotypical partner might be thinking. So I'll do a lot of, I don't know for certain, but my sense is that this person is thinking this, 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 and this. And then we'll talk about that together. We'll be like, maybe they're not. So again, whereas the tradition might be to kind of hold back on some of that stuff and to, you know, actually you can just be like, well, this is generally what people think. What does that mean? What's that like? Do you want to add anything in there, Sash?
No, I mean, I think that's bang on. It's a lot of the time, because again, you want that authenticity with it. You know, you don't want to bullshit and say, oh, this is a social rule, because there are no actual social rules. There's a kind of an assumption that we're all following a particular set of rules, but they're very woolly rules. I mean, there's exceptions to them all the time. It's like body language, you know, it's not an exact science at all. No. And I think a lot of the time there's a kind of almost a gatekeeping around that, like, you know, people who profess to be body language experts or whatever, you know, and something around the sort of shaming of autistic people. I think, Ingrid, you mentioned in the chat as well some stuff around research that's come up recently around body language and how actually it shows that it's not that autistic people don't do body language, it's that they don't do it in the same way. So actually that things like facial expressions, it is just a different language between neurotypicals and between autistic people. And actually, to an autistic person, they can read each other's facial expression very, very easily, no problem. But it doesn't translate, and also it doesn't translate both ways. So it's not just that it's autistic people not getting neurotypical people's facial expressions. It works both ways. It's also neurotypical people not getting autistic people's facial expressions, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Ingrid, you've got your hand up. Go for it.
Yeah, and also Gerda's had a question in the chat. Just
okay,
cool. I'm aware of jumping in here when Gerda was first, but it's very connected to what you're saying, is that teaching autistic people, in inverted commas, what the neurotypical person might be thinking and how to do that puts the burden on the autistic person to mask more, to meet the neurotypical person on their terms, and it's exhausting. So I think it's important to actually validate the fact that autistic people feel more comfortable around autistic people, and to find an autistic community and know, when do I feel co-regulation? When do I feel calm? And actually, I don't have to force myself to be in a neurotypical context where I'm not having fun. You know, I don't think we should spend too much time trying to train our autistic clients to engage on neurotypical terms.
No,
I agree with you. I mean, the way I normally handle it is fundamentally validating the way they are, the way their point of view. If they want to tackle, to use some skills. So with most of the people I work with, it's about validating that. They may choose to play some neurotypical stuff when they do a job interview. And that's their choice, and they're doing it for a finite period of time because they want to. And I think that's absolutely fine, that's completely legitimate. But fundamentally, validating the way they are and highlighting the fact that they're dealing with kind of constantly being pushed and forced to be in a way that isn't typical. I would highlight, just as a kind of word, that although most of the people I know feel very comfortable with other autistic people or other divergent people, neurodivergent people, that is generally the flavor. Some don't. So some don't want to be in autistic or neurodiverse circles.
Yeah.
And actually they really struggle with it. So again, you know, just to kind of, but it's again just kind of being mindful, isn't it? Sorry, Sash, we had a question, didn't we?
Yeah, Gerda, I think, was gonna say something.
Or was it in the chat, I think? Is it in the chat, Julia?
Yep.
Yeah, chat.
Okay.
Gerda, do you want to say it in words?
Yeah, I was just thinking, if you have a suspicion that someone might be he's showing autistic behavior and he might be in that domain, but because it's the constant the mention of the relationship, the couple, the challenges within the marriage. And now I also know he's an Enneagram 5 and the wife is a 2, so that is in the back of my mind. And I don't want to box anything here, but this session, attending the session, created some awareness for me, because at work even, this guy's the CEO, but he had to appoint someone else that can run the business, because he's just, sorry for my language, pissing off everyone. And I have such a soft heart for him and understanding, but I now feel as if I have a better understanding of where he might come from and why it might be even more difficult. But with everything being said, also know now the awareness of, I don't even have to suggest this to him, that it might be just to work with, that it might or it might not be. Not to go deeper and label anything, because it's not necessary, actually.
Exactly.
But for me as the coach, to create that space for expression, for connecting to his own emotions, his values, that values link, emotion linked to values, it's definitely a big thing for me, an awareness for me now.
I totally agree with you, Donna. I think that is exactly it. You don't, I mean, I wouldn't mention any labels unless someone said that to me, but I would be mindful. And exactly the way that you mentioned, I would hold that really lightly. So I would have a sense of, I'm noticing some ways of being with this person. It could be this, but it might not be. Let's explore that together. And I think what you said there about just holding it lightly and having it there in your mind, but not allow, and then in going for the expression, you know, bringing different tools in that you think might be helpful. Yeah, totally. I agree with that completely.
Thank you.
Okay, so you all have the slides, you can look at it later, but flexibility and creativity, we've talked about that already, really. You can be as flexible as you like and you can be as creative as you like. So, you know, I'll work with people on, you know, audio and chat, and outside I used to sometimes go on walks with people, and, you know, you might do loads of drawing one time and talk the next, and, you know, it can vary, and you can be creative, and engaging with their interests and stuff is wicked.
Yeah. And for heaven's sake, autistic people love metaphor. There's not this.
Yes.
There's a real reluctance sometimes to use these kind of creative explorations because of a stereotype that autistic people don't have a good enough imagination to do it. But actually, again, it's just a difference in the way that imagination is used. Yeah. Don't shy away from creative explorations just because someone's autistic.
Absolutely. So we've kind of touched on this already, but you were talking, Ingrid, about, like, you know, the masking and stuff. And one of the things that, from an existential point of view, that both Sash and I have really noticed is that, you know, for autistic people, they're specifically, sometimes neurodivergent more generally, but more so for autistic clients, they're not kind of caught up in all of the social flim-flam. And what that means is that they are kind of confronted with the realities of life in a way that it is really profound, like the uncertainty. I had a client who'd say to me, you know, I'd say, I'll see you next week, and she'd be like, well, you might not. You know, that was really present for her. Her awareness of time, her awareness of her own mortality was present in a way that it wouldn't be for a non-autistic person. So that kind of, without that cloak of the kind of social comfort that is really, you know, that we cloak ourselves with, and we do, you know, it means that kind of the reality, the awareness can be even more acute, and that can mean struggling with kind of coming to terms with finding a sense of self, you know, being, you know, struggling with anxiety more so, all of these things. So for me, there's something about really honoring and acknowledging the fact that they are facing kind of a reality of being human, possibly in a way that is more connected and more intense than other people who have kind of got their heads in, you know, I don't know, Insta.
Basically, Ruth and I, as existential practitioners who are interested in this kind of thing, have a working theory that we must write up.
Yes,
that,
we do.
That essentially autistic individuals specifically are much more in tune with these kind of big existential ideas.
Yeah, exactly.
And so in acknowledging that, there is a movement away from this notion that autistic people have somehow got it wrong, and actually an acknowledgement that, no, you've got it very right. You're picking up on big issues here that people spend a lifetime trying to avoid, and you're thrown into anxiety because you're having to negotiate these all the time. You're aware of them all the time.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. It's called truth. Spot on.
Exactly that. Yeah. We've touched this bit, but one of the things about the directness and the abruptness can sometimes be considered aggressive and controlling. And so I see it so often with like people getting, I don't know, they lose their job, or relationships break down, or they get chucked out of their therapy because they've been too aggressive, or they've been too kind of, and it's not, they're just being like, you know, they're calling you out when you mucked up, and they're expecting you to actually be honest about it rather than like playing any social game. So I always think that's important to mention. Practical techniques can be helpful. Oh, cool. Okay, good. Right, questions, comments. I wonder if anyone has anything that they want to ask. Go for it. I'll stop sharing this, and I'll make sure that I send it to you guys.
Thank you. I've got an ADHD question.
Go for it, please. Give us an ADHD question.
So one of the things that's most annoying about me for my partners is that I can't focus on them for long periods of time. And it's like a micro abandonment process that goes on during the day when I'm with them. And it's very unsettling. And I'm quite aware of it. And I try and work with it. But I'm just wondering if you wanted to comment on that, and if you've heard of this thing before.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Did you want to say something?
Well, I was going to say, this is really, I've come across this a lot from people who either are ADHD or ADD or have some comorbidity as part of their autistic diagnosis with those sort of attention issues. And I think one of the things that can be really useful is thinking about ways that you can spend time with people where there's a certain amount of variation, where it's not like you have to hyper focus on that one thing that's going on, because like the chances are, if you're trying to watch a film together, you're going to be off doing bits and pieces, because that's naturally how your brain works, and that's okay. So finding ways to be together where actually the variance can be part of the experience that you have together, rather than something that takes you away from them, is really important.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because there's no just watching movies with someone for me. I have boxes of equipment that sit next to my TV so that I can even sit for long periods of time.
Absolutely. And so, you know, if you're at work, I mean, I've been twiddling the whole time that we've been having this session. You know, that's exactly. So that's something that, like, there's no reason why everybody shouldn't be allowed to do that, and to move and engage, and having that as And what's tricky, obviously, is getting them to understand that it's not because you don't want to be with them, and it's not because that you don't love them. It's just because your brain works this way and you need to be moving. I mean, that's another kind of relational issue. But I hear what you say, and I think it's so important just kind of allowing that and validating that.
That's such an important thing. It's about the meaning, isn't it, that we ascribe to all of these things, and actually having an open dialogue about what the meaning is and breaking it down can be really useful in dealing with those situations. But of course, people get heated and emotional about all sorts. So, you know, as logical as it is, there's always going to be.
One of my very good friends, he has ADHD. He's also an ADHD assessor. And he just like, he has to walk and move all the time. So I'll just leave my door open. I'll sit down and he'll just be walking up and down whilst having a conversation with me. And that's cool. It's like, I just have to make sure that my attention is good enough. But yeah, absolutely. I'm mindful of time.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat around CPTSD and ADHD and autism and the overlap.
Yeah. So complex PTSD is when it's often it's more about kind of the attachment issues and emotional issues. And I mean, I think a lot of autistic and ADHD people experience trauma, and CPD in particular, for all of the reasons that we've kind of talked about in terms of, you know, what their growing up environment and what their relational environment has been like and what they've experienced and what that's meant. I mean, it's a huge topic, but absolutely, I think there's often that overlap.
Any other questions? Sorry.
Hand out your emails, addresses, or maybe pop them in the chat boxes, because I can see, you know, at first glance, the subject seems very specific, but what is really interesting is how many people are dealing with this as part of their coaching and psychotherapy practice. And I'd love to kind of connect, because you also run a master's in.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's masters and postgraduate certificates in autism, ADHD, and we often have a lot of, you know, therapists, coaches, teachers, who want to go deeper and want to enable them to kind of to specialize. There are also kind of one-off courses that we run through the Existential Academy as well, like you know 2-3 hours. There's those types of stuff we do, and then there's the kind of the certificates or the masters. So if anyone's interested or anyone has any questions, generally you can always drop Sasha and I a line, drop us an email. We love it. We love it.
And how do you have like a mailing list, or how do we get on so that when something comes? I know I'm on a mailing list, but I don't know if there's a specific one.
There isn't yet. We should have a mailing list. This is me with my terrible organizational skills. I need to have my own PA. If you'd like to know about what we're doing and what we're up to, let us know. Email us, let us know, and we will include you in the updates that we have. We are on Twitter, but I don't know what my Twitter handle is.
Good. That's those brilliant organizational skills again.
It's my executive functioning. Ding! I can't remember what it is. That's the problem. I can't remember.
Well, you two have been absolutely brilliant.
It's been so lovely.
Really, really helpful, just to me personally, and I can see people's eyebrows and faces, and I see how this information is settled in them, and what value they've taken out of this session. So thank you.
I want to second that. It was very valuable. I've really struggled to get to any of Julia's sessions, and I'm so glad that I got to this one for personal and professional reasons. So thank you very much.
Oh, bless you guys.
Thank you.
Oh, it's been so lovely. Do keep in touch and email us and whatnot, because we love to keep in touch with you all. It's been really lovely to meet you. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Can we bring you back? Can we bring you back?
Of course. We can. Of course, if you can put up with us, very welcome. It might be worse behaved.
Just don't forget, okay?
No, that's what Sasha's for. That's what Sasha's
for. Okay.
I'm the external hard drive. I can
external hard drive.
That's where I shine.
Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Can I chat to you two just before you disappear? Everyone else can.
Sure.
Take her off. Take her off. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm going to just pause this.